This is a AS history video looking at the presidency of Richard Nixon and the Watergate scandal. Nixon beat Hubert Humphrey to become president in November 1968. There were a number of reasons for his election success. The Republican Party had picked him because he was loyal and had been a hard-working party member, particularly since his election defeat in 1960. He was considered to be moderate, not somebody that would be too extreme and offend left or right-wing extreme. He campaigned on the need for new leadership, and in particular targeted middle-class white Americans who were very concerned about a wave of protests across America which seemed to be increasingly violent. These are people that felt out of place in the America of the 1960s, and Nixon was solidity. Nixon was safe. He emphasised the fundamental American values, and he actually made very limited public appearances compared to his rival, Humphrey. That just made Nixon look statesmanlike, dignified and experienced. He used television a lot to reach a wider audience. He kept his tan topped up in Florida. It's important. First television presidential campaign really where coloured television was common. He used his family to help gain votes. His wife Pat, his children Julie and David looked fresh-faced and innocent. They were a perfect soap opera family. He was endorsed by President Eisenhower, virtually from Eisenhower's deathbed. He selected a valuable, good running mate. Spiro Agnew was tall, handsome and physically imposing. And really what Nixon was successful at was identifying himself with middle America, that silent majority of not rich, not poor, not black, not young, who were out of place, who opposed the 1960s radicalism and change. He won lots of votes in the South by promising to slow down the pace of school desegregation. Ending the Vietnam War was key. Peace with honour was Nixon's campaign slogan, designed to phase out American troops and leave the fighting to the South Vietnamese. It also meant an end to the draft. The chaos at the Chicago Democrat Convention, with students throwing bags of urine at the police and making love on the grass outside the hotel, made Nixon look better because his rally was very well behaved. It was ticket only. If you had long hair, you didn't get in, and hecklers were beaten up by off-duty local policemen who'd been paid by Nixon's campaign team. Incidentally, Nixon's Secret Service detail had refused to beat up these protesters. Despite all this, the result was very close, but Nixon did win. His first term as president was relatively successful. Most of it was designed to win him a second term. In terms of civil rights, he tried to slow down the desegregation of schools by trying to block the busing of black students to white schools. He nominated a number of conservative, or in some cases racist, judges to the Supreme Court. He vetoed the 1971 Child Development Act, which would have provided free childcare for the poor because it was too expensive. This pleased conservatives who believed that mothers should stay at home and look after the children, and who opposed abortion. In the economy, it was more difficult. America was in big trouble with inflation and high unemployment. Nixon introduced a new policy called the New Economic Policy, which introduced a wage price freeze and devalued the dollar, making US exports cheaper and more competitive. Nixon quickly dropped the name New Economic Policy when it was pointed out that in Soviet Russia, Lenin had also introduced a new economic policy. And for a lifelong anti-communist like Nixon, that was quite an embarrassing mistake. And in the long term, his new policies didn't work. But in the short term, it did help to get him re-elected. Foreign policy was probably Nixon's most successful area. He began the process of Vietnamization to bring American troops out of Vietnam. He agreed was known as SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, with the Russian President Brezhnev to slow down the nuclear arms race. He also became the first American president to visit communist China in 1972. That got huge press coverage, and Nixon was clever. He waited for 9 hours in Alaska so that his plane would land in Washington at 9 p.m, just in time for the primetime TV news programs. In 1972, this success was reflected by a landslide win for him in the presidential elections. He got 60.7% of the vote, beating the rather weak Democratic candidate George McGovern. And it was in his second term that the events took place that came to make Nixon notorious and infamous, the Watergate scandal. Much of the Watergate scandal involves some of Nixon's key advisors. Two of the main advisors to Nixon were guys called Bob Haldeman and John Ehrlichman. Haldeman was Nixon's chief of staff, which means largely he controls the White House and is one of Nixon's most important aides. Ehrlichman was the domestic affairs advisor. And Nixon put a lot of the blame for what happened at Watergate on them. Also, we have to look at John Mitchell. John Mitchell had been Attorney General, the head of the Justice Department, from 1969 to 72, but he resigned in 1972 to become the head of the campaign to re-elect the president. Only these guys could have thought that it was a good idea to set up a group called CREEP. CREEP, and under John Mitchell, approved wiretaps without court authorization, prosecuted anti-war protesters, and tried to block publication of Pentagon papers. They were incredibly antagonistic towards the press, seeing the press as enemies. All three of these men were really quite nasty and cynical. All they did was bring out the very worst in Richard Nixon. Other key conspirators were John Dean, who was the Associate Deputy Attorney General, Charles Colson, who was a lawyer who worked on CREEP. Colson famously suggested giving an anti-Nixon commentator LSD just before he went on television. Others included Jeb Magruder, James McCord, E. Howard Hunt and Gordon Liddy. Watergate was the name of an office block in Washington, D.C. It housed the headquarters of the Democratic Party in Washington, which is why it was a target for CREEP. Look at some of the things that CREEP were doing in 1972. It does shock and probably offend. They were carrying out surveillance illegally on political rivals. They were trying to subvert the political progress, and they were illegally fundraising. They collected over $60 million of odd money, really, that was not legally collected. The chairman of McDonald's donated $255,000 to CREEP. In return, McDonald's was allowed to continue price increases on cheeseburgers at a time when everybody else was being told not to increase prices. A guy called Walter Annenberg paid $250,000 in order to get the ambassador to London job. Some of the surveillance that carried on, particularly on Edward Kennedy, the younger brother of the Kennedy clan, who was considering running as Democratic candidate, was aimed on trying to catch Kennedy with other women. CREEP also lied to the press on frequent occasions. It was Gordon Liddy who suggested electronic eavesdropping, but he also suggested kidnapping political opponents, disrupting Democratic political meetings, and employing prostitutes at the Democratic National Convention. The key event was when CREEP organised 2 illegal break-ins into the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate building in June of 1972. These break-ins were aimed at finding information about the Democrats' political campaign. The second break-in was discovered, and the burglars, including McCord, Liddy and Hunt, were arrested. Nixon was informed immediately, but wasn't worried. In quote, he said, "I think the country does not give much of a shit when somebody bugs somebody else." Nixon was involved in that cover-up right from the start. He claimed that the Democrats had been doing this for years, which may well be true, but they'd never been caught. Nixon tried to bribe the burglars to keep quiet about his involvement. He offered them $430,000 each, which they accepted. They were convicted and received between 20 and 40 years. These are serious crimes. Unfortunately for Nixon, the press uncovered the plot. It was led by two Washington Post reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. There were a lot of other reporters that were involved in this. And over the next few weeks and months, the newspapers began to break the story. The Senate set up a select committee on presidential campaign activities led by Sam Ervin. That involved 37 days of televised hearings. On the 30th of April 1973, John Dean, Bob Haldeman and John Ehrlichman all resigned. Nixon announced that they had been involved in a cover-up, but it was without his knowledge. On the 16th of July 1973, it was revealed that there was a bugging system throughout the White House. Pressure rose for those tapes to be released. By October 1973, there's now huge pressure on Nixon. There's a real possibility of him being impeached, which means sacked as president and arrested. That would involve putting the president on trial. To make things worse, Vice President Spiro Agnew was forced to resign when it was uncovered that he was guilty of tax evasion and accepting bribes. Nixon's own finances were under intense investigation. He'd received an income of $1.1 million during his first term, but had paid less than $80,000 in taxes, and had paid for improvements to two of his houses from public funds. There was also talk that he was drinking heavily. The important bugging tapes from the White House were finally surrendered in November 1973, but with 18.5-minute gap in a conversation between Nixon and Haldeman. Those tapes had obviously been tampered with. But Nixon said, quote, "I am not a crook." He was finally forced to give up the transcripts of more tapes in July 1974, and one of those proved that Nixon had ordered the cover-up and engaged in a conspiracy to obstruct justice. The House Judiciary Committee approved his impeachment. To avoid that, on the 8th of August 1974, he resigned. By resigning, he kept his $60,000 a year presidential pension and $100,000 a year in staff expenses. He was promised that there'd be no charges if he quit. Watergate's incredibly significant. He's the first president to resign in office, and Nixon is always ranked at or near the bottom in any poll of presidents. In 1977, he admitted that he let the country down. His biggest mistake, he said, was the cover-up. In a famous interview with David Frost, he said, "I let down my friends. I let down the country. I let down our system of government and the dreams of all those young people that ought to get into government, but think it's all too corrupt." Historian Ivan Morgan said that Nixon's presidency is marked by the worst abuse of presidential power in US history. The press believed the role they'd played in the Watergate scandal made them the great guardians of democracy. Woodward and Bernstein inspired a generation of reporters to dig away at potential political scandal in order to make their name. And Congress enacted several laws to try and limit presidential power and avoid another Watergate. Many people believed there'd been either a drunk or a madman in the White House. The Republican Party also suffered greatly. When Gerald Ford pardoned Nixon, that probably cost him the 1976 election. And one lasting legacy is that any scandal ever carried out, whenever it's broken in the press, tends to be called something gate. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you found this useful.